This is Dan McLaughlin, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
Hey, Dan, thanks for coming on. It seems like you're on all the time, either talking baseball, but not often do we talk about your work at the National Review. Why don't you introduce what we're talking about today?
Sure. So, as probably at least some viewers know, the New York Times Magazine published in the summer of 2019 what they called the 1619 Project, which was essentially an effort to, as they described it, reframe American history around slavery and race. And so, I think the idea, in theory, of introducing, a greater sort of Black history perspective to American history, in and of itself, that's not objectionable, right? That's filling out the context that you need to understand the full American story. But the idea of displacing the American founding and displacing 1776 and the Pilgrims and everything, and saying, look, no, our real history is the history of slavery, and that's what makes us unique as a country, right? Going back to the sort of very first slaves arriving in the English colonies, not the first in the modern America, but in the English colonies in 1619, as the American founding, I think is misguided. And I think a lot of us felt that it was misguided. So what we sought to do at National Review in our latest issue, that's up on the web now and will be in the mailboxes of subscribers and on the newsstands in the coming weeks, is a package of essays on various aspects of American slavery and the 1619 Project. And so the big piece that I did, which is, quite lengthy and in-depth, is to really, ask this question. If you say that slavery is what makes us unique, how unique is slavery in America? Isn't in fact there a much broader global story of slavery that America is only a part of? And then ask, okay, well, what aspects of American slavery were unique or different or similar to slave systems in other parts of the world? And then also, I think it's also the flip side of that is to consider that Americans actually play a much larger role in the history of world abolition than the history of world slavery, right? I mean, until before 1775, before the beginnings of the American Revolution, I mean, there really was no real political abolitionist movement anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And so it actually begins here.
One of the things that we often do in history is we lose a grasp of the totality of history, and then also when history sort of fades out and archaeology and anthropology sort of jump in. Let me bring Wil in here, who's also an author on this thing, Wil Reilly. Everybody. And so, Wil, we just got started. Dan was introducing the project, and I'm sort of just talking now about the scope of history. One of the things that I found problematic with the 1619, almost from the jump, is they make this very contextualized argument, and they draw a circle around very specific Western European people who are in, the Virginia area, and 1619, as if there were no slaves before. And really, the history of humanity is complete with slaves. We all descend from slaves. I'm not the first person to say that. The Roman dude that says it was probably not the first dude that said it. It goes back a long way. So we lose track of that, the fact that there were slaves here already. And I also don't know how you can sell the fact that when 1619, I'm not saying that there wasn't a slave ship in 1619, but are we left to presume that someone just thought, hey, I'll go grab a bunch of Black people and just float down the eastern seaboard until I find a market that's open? Or did they, in fact, already have an existing trade route set? So this goes to your overall point, Dan, about the history and how much history there's there. And then also, how improbable the ending of slavery, if it, in fact, is ended in modern times, where we're at now. There's just your article is long and very detailed. Talk a little bit about the scope of the history that we're talking about. How far back does it go? And then, it seems like the English and the Americans tried like hell to end it, granted in our own ham-handed, horrible way. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I mean, it's a big topic. I mean, my article is quite long, and honestly, the first draft of it was at least a third longer than that. Um, there is a lot to cover, and it is true that most of the world's people are descended from slave owners, slaves, slave traders, or all of the above, because this is something that has existed. Its origins are lost in time. It goes back as far as antiquity, whether it's antiquity in the book of Genesis or in ancient Greece and Rome or ancient, Egypt. And, I tried to take a really global look. I mean, Seymour Drescher's work, a great historian of slavery, was probably the most useful thing I relied on, but there was a lot of different sources. And he's covered, the perspective on the history of slavery in China and India, in Russia, Russia was pretty much from the beginning a slave society. In Alexander II, the Tsar who freed the serfs, right? And Russian serfs were, if you look seriously at the life of a Russian serf, they were not much better off than American slaves, if at all. I mean, it was very similar legal, in terms of their legal rights, in terms of the kind of abuses they suffered, whether it be, serf women being abused by the nobles, or, if you spoke up, you could be whipped, you could be sent to Siberia, you could be sent to the army. But in 1861, when Alexander signs the order emancipating the serfs, the night before Lincoln's inauguration, interestingly enough, at that point, there were 23 million serfs in Russia. That's about 3 times the number of people who were enslaved in the Western Hemisphere at that point. But I mean, if you look around the globe, and the history of African slavery certainly precedes the arrival of the Europeans. And probably something like half of the African slave trade, the external African slave trade, not even the internal trade, the external trade, probably about half of it goes places other than Europe and the West. And so you have, all of these different systems of slavery. I mean, I thought one of the most interesting things looking is particularly at the 15 and 1600s, right? Because if you look in the 1500s, the slave trade across the Black Sea, right, which is principally Russians, Ukrainians, and other Slavs being enslaved. That's even the origin of the modern word slave, right? Slav, being enslaved primarily in the Ottoman Empire, was larger than the trade across the Atlantic. In the first half of the 1600s, the trade of Europeans and Black Africans into North Africa was larger. At that point, well into the 1640s, there were more British slaves held in Africa than there were African slaves held in the British colonies. Now, that all shifts very, very dramatically in the second half of the 1600s. It's the explosion of sugar production, particularly in the Caribbean. And on the other hand, what else is happening at that same time period, in terms of the perspective here, is the rise of Russia gradually chokes off the external Russian slave trade, right? The Slavic peoples get freed, not from slavery by other Russians, but they get freed from slavery by the Ottomans in stages because of the rise of Russia as a power, right? Russia basically, and most of the history of anti-slavery before 1775 is that kind of anti-slavery, right? Which is some country rises up in power, a government, a church, and they say, you're not going to enslave our people anymore, right? But it's rarely a moral movement to free others. And that moral movement really only takes off in the 1770s. And it starts in the United States and in Britain, but, as a political matter. I mean, frankly, it doesn't exist as a bottom-up political movement before then, because until that period, there is no bottom-up political movement for anything anywhere in the world, right? The world is full of, the king, the headman, the chief, the caliph, the pope, whoever, dictating things downward. So it's actually, I think, not coincidental, really, that the rise of popular self-government coincides with the rise of a moral movement against slavery.
Wil?
Yeah, I didn't want to really bust in on kind of the flow of conversation there, but yeah, I would agree that much of that is true. Dan and I actually both appeared in this recent collection of articles about slavery, as I understand. And yeah, I mean, the 1619 Project, I think, has a couple of flaws. One of them is this, that they focus only on contemporary Black slavery in the American context. And there are a couple of others. I mean, they don't discuss the actual economic impact of slavery in the USA, in the American South, which I don't think was positive at all when empirically analyzed. They don't really discuss the counterpoint movement toward abolitionism, toward anti-racism that's existed throughout American history, and that in the end obviously was successful. I mean, we've had pro-minority affirmative action in the USA since 1967. And they also, I think, make a lot of broad and almost crazy claims. I mean, we've all heard the one-line argument that the American Revolutionary War was fought primarily because of the desire to keep Black slaves. But I mean, even beyond that, one of the claims in the original 1619 marketing material set was virtually everything exceptional about the USA came out of slavery, emerged out of slavery. And I mean, when I've brought that up to friends in the academy or in contemporary journalism, I mean, people ask practical questions like Asian immigration. I mean, could anyone actually believe that's true? So, I mean, those are, I think, the issues. I didn't really have that much to say in terms of Dan's opener there. Yeah, slavery was absolutely universal for humans. I mean, slavery was the stage of anthropological development, to quote Marvin Harris, that came immediately after killing and eating your defeated enemies. So, I mean, it's something that's existed for tens of thousands of years, most likely on every continent. I mean, in my own essay, I discussed this a little more briefly, but obviously the ancient Greeks and Romans engaged in the practice. Aristotle actually wrote some pretty eloquent lines defending what he called natural slavery. He thought that a large number of people, including, I would suspect, the whites of the North and the Blacks of the South, were naturally suited to be enslaved and taught by better people, by which he basically meant Greeks. And I mean, you really go forward from there. Chattel serfdom was extraordinarily common throughout history. I think one of the more obvious points Dan made is that the Arabic slave trade into Africa went on for significantly longer than the white-run Atlantic slave trade and involved the transshipment of more people. The highest figure I've seen from, I believe it's Zuide, the Tanzanian academic, is 17 million. Jeez. And there's a whole long history there of conflict between the Arab states and civilized Bantu peoples. I mean, if you simply search Zanj wars online, you'll find this conflict that went on for decades and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. It's totally unknown in the modern West. So, yeah, I managed to talk there for a couple of minutes, but I don't know how much that actually added. Yes, slavery was something that was absolutely a part of modern human history until, and I think here's the kicker, the West ended it in the 1850s, 1860s, and so on going forward. Prior to that, I've actually read Ibn Sina, many of the writers in the Arabic tradition, and outside of some East Asian countries, I don't think there'd been a lot of philosophical consideration that taking defeated enemies and making them work was bad. Just as there hadn't been a great deal of mental gymnastics spent thinking about the death penalty. This was just the way things were. If you lost, you got your ass on the other guy's boat and you rowed for a couple of years. There's a galley slave tradition that, again, rimmed the Mediterranean. So until recently, the analogy that comes to my mind, last sentence, until recently, slavery was considered globally probably the way we consider factory farming and meat eating today. Well, it's an ugly business, but that's what happens. It's what's always happened. It's part of being a human. Everyone's a fighting man. And if you get caught from that point forward, you're a working man, possibly after some surgical modification. So that was the reality of the slave tradition that our ancestors, white and black, actually challenged. And I think what 1619 does, instead of presenting the uniqueness of Western resistance to slavery, they almost write a sort of semi-literate narrative of unique Western slavery. So, I mean, good on Dan for calling that out. And I think that was generally the response to 1619. I don't know too many serious historians, journalists, political scientists, etc., that accepted 1619. I mean, the World Socialist Forum criticized it in a lengthy and skillful series of pieces. So that is the baseline there. Yes, slavery, unfortunately, universal until quite recently.
Yeah, and the World Socialists did some remarkable work on this, actually. I mean, look at. I mean, look at 1619 in Virginia. I mean, first of all, I think the most important historical event in 1619 in Virginia is not the arrival of some slaves. There had been slaves already in Georgia and Florida as almost a century before that, and certainly throughout the Caribbean. And the leading man of Jamestown, John Smith, right, was himself a former escaped slave. He had been again, like Will said, he was captured by the, he had captured, well, yeah. But he had been captured by the Turks and while serving in the army of the Austrians. But the most important event of that period, of that year in Virginia, is the Virginia General Assembly, the House of Burgesses. It's the first representative assembly in the Western Hemisphere. And so, that is really where things begin to diverge in the United States. And I think for example, look at the whole of the Western Hemisphere. You had African slaves imported. You had indigenous people who were first enslaved and then, and then abused in various other ways. And the United States is not different. But what is different is essentially that you have this demographic, you have this free population. And that is actually, it's the free population that grows and creates something genuinely unique. And the contrast between, essentially white freedom and black slavery is what creates this clash that drives ultimately, American anti-slavery. Because it's a recognition that slavery stuck out in the United States, that it was different, that it didn't fit with the rest of society.
One of my criticisms when we talk about slavery, and this is why I appreciate you guys coming on and doing this, and why I appreciate the National Review for covering it, is people can talk intelligently about it for maybe about 30 seconds, and they have to caveat to say slavery was horrible, and then they say a bunch of talking points. And we really quickly lose track of the fact that not just white people enslaved people, white people enslaved white people, everybody enslaved each other. In my history, I've been going through my lineage. I am probably descended from Edmund Scarborough, who was sent over by the King of England to help run Virginia. I'm also descended from apparently some Native American people, and also people who were indentured servants. We all have these varied pasts. No one has just this one path of slavery. And the other thing I wanted to mention, when Will talked about 1619 and the claim that everything is descended from slavery, that has been proven false any number of ways. And also Chris Thomas King, the musician, would submit, and he's written it in his book, that the history of the blues is from free, not even like freed slaves, but free black people in New Orleans. Because when you sail down the Mississippi and you drop off your load and you get paid, what do? You want to go party. And that means you go out and you literally walk into these barrel houses where all the music is happening. And that's where the blues is born. But if you read the more outdated history, they came in with a presupposition that this was slave-based music. And Chris does a wonderful job of tearing all that apart. Now, could we do a better job of, like we talked about right from the beginning, Dan, of telling more of the black story or more of the multi-ethnicity history of America? For sure. But we've got to do a better job of being able to tolerate the conversation about slavery. If we don't know anything more, like if we don't know, Britain's role, like Charles Gordon, who helps end or at least begin the end of slavery, in Khartoum and that area and everything, then we're not taking the problem seriously. We're not looking at it in a serious academic way so that we can then all try to gain some understanding. And if 1619 wants to stand up as a standard, great, then compare and contrast what's already there with actual things, not talking points. And I'm just really critical of that part of it. I don't know what you guys have to say about any of that. I'm kind of just rambling, kind of doing a Will thing on this end. But when Will's like, my last sentence, and talk for another minute.
Well, I mean, I did do a little bit of an introductory ramble there, but I like to break down how long things are going to take when I do talk or give a piece.
Yeah.
I would say actually one point that both of you guys have touched on here is I don't think that 1619 necessarily wants to talk more honestly about the multi-ethnic history of the USA. Actually, I don't get that impression at all. I think the focus of the 1619 project is almost entirely on this claim that American blacks are a unique case. Like, there's not really any discussion of slavery in any other circumstances, and there's not really much discussion of the contributions made by other groups to the USA. So, I mean, just the first point is either, there's probably Dan, it might have been you as well, Pete, but the point was made that there were slaves in the USA dating back to more than 100 years before 1619. And to some extent, that's self-evidently true. I mean, the Spanish conquistadors landed in the Americas in 1492. And that's something that's rarely discussed from this perspective because it's troubling to some extent. I mean, the reality that native tribes like the Haida fought constantly and often took slaves. There's a great piece about this, which describes it as predatory warfare, sort of complicates the narrative of bad white men arrived at the kind of the narrative of two original sins, right? Like bad white men arrived in and conquered Eden, and they brought forced slave labor for the first time. It almost parallels the biblical narrative. And in fact, neither point is true. There'd been considerable conflict in Eden for centuries or millennia. And slavery was not only well known there, but was also a key part of the Spanish conquest. The Spanish enslaved the civilized native people. The Spanish had a substantial number of black slaves, probably some slaves of Middle Eastern descent as well, so on down the line. And I mean, that same theme continues. I don't notice a focus of 1619 on, for example, Chinese American immigration or something like that. So,
yeah, and I mean,
this time, but the whole idea is what makes this country unique is us. Now, I'm very pro-black, and I think there's been a substantial black contribution to the USA. What makes the United States stand out in many arenas, music, for example, really is that combination of Anglo-Saxon and black culture. But there also is a great deal more to the country. I mean, the American Southwest is an integral part of the USA, so on down the line.
Yeah, I mean, even, part of the idea of American uniqueness, for example, is to look at, okay, there was no slavery, before Columbus in like England, in France, in a certain corner of Northwestern Europe. But first of all, that's not 100% true because, of course, the French king declared France free of slavery in 1315, and for centuries after that, you still had French galley slaves, right? But even accepting that corner of Europe was unique even within Europe, right? And so up to the time of the Age of Discovery, you still have slavery very much alive in Spain and Portugal, and in parts of Italy. To say nothing of sort of these vast empires of serfdom in Russia and Eastern Europe. And so when you look at the Spanish conquests and the Portuguese conquests, they're much more of a continuum. Now, part of the thing that's interesting to me is that I think in some ways slavery was worse in the English colonies because they came over without a tradition of slavery, right? Because slavery and serfdom had died out within England. Within Britain by the time of the exploration. And so they didn't have some of the ameliorating and mitigating forces that existed in the law and in custom that existed in slave societies around the world. And so they sort of reached to Roman law, which is ancient and harsh. And even the American South, a lot of it drew on Roman law. Which was particularly brutal towards slaves. I mean, the Romans were an enormous slave society, the empire at its peak, and particularly within Italy, not just in sort of the outlying areas of the empire. The other point that I tried to touch on in my essay was really to look at what was unique about American slavery, and none of its aspects were entirely unique, but I think unique in combination. And part of it is, of course, as I said, that slavery stuck out in a free society. But part of it is the combination that, because slaves were racially distinct in the society, because they were held in, inheritable chattel slavery treated as property. And yet, because there was a self-sustaining population, you have high birth rates among American slaves from an early time, which is very much not what's going on. Like the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, a much higher proportion of it went to the Caribbean went to Brazil, right? But why? The descendants of those slaves are much fewer. I mean, if you look at, say, Jamaica, I think they had it was something like 750,000 people to Jamaica over, the 3 centuries before 1808. And yet they had 350,000 slaves there at that time. Well, why? Because mostly they were importing men, and most of the men they worked to death. American slaves had a much more even gender balance. They lived in conditions that were more conducive to forming families. And so what American slavery did almost uniquely was to create a people apart who were forged by slavery, who saw slavery in their own history, and who were, because of racist laws, sort of kept separate in a lot of ways for a long time after emancipation. And so when we look back and we say, why is slavery seem so unique in America? It's not because we had something other people didn't have. It is in large part because we have a large population of Americans today who see themselves as, they have a unique institutional and communal memory of slavery in a way that is much more ambiguous in a lot of other countries.
Yeah, one comment there. That's the entire idea in the Black community of ADOS, being an American descendant of slaves. And that actually gets back one point. Obviously, all slavery is, by modern standards, brutal and horrific, even more so than the rest of history was brutal and horrific, with its indentured servitude, the inability of women to vote, and so on down the line. And it's sometimes worth going through any competent historical resource and just reminding yourself of what the laws were. I mean, marital rape in the USA technically wasn't possible, at least nationally, until 1993. Women couldn't vote until 1920. So again, as a Black man, I'm very aware of the horrors of slavery, but also most periods before the present have been considered primitive by most civilized people. And the USA is no exception to that trend. But I mean, in terms of the comment that American slavery was uniquely brutal because it was modeled on the old Roman laws, I mean, my understanding was that many of those were modified pretty rapidly. And the best evidence of that to some extent is that there are a lot of Black people in the USA today. That doesn't excuse, again, the disgusting reality of slavery, but something like 12 million people, fewer than the number transshipped through the Arabic slave trade, but a very substantial number were shipped from Africa as part of the Atlantic slave trade. And only, as I'm sure both of you guys know, and only about 400,000 of those people came to the USA. But that became the basis of virtually the entire Black American population. The reason that the much, much, much larger populations of people shipped into, for example, the northern part of South America didn't produce that same follow-up communities, that an unfortunately large number of those people died. I mean, they were worked to death. They were on large, all-male plantations. There's a different disease environment from the old world to the new, as the Indians unfortunately found out. So, I mean, the huge majority of those people had a life expectancy of, and this is a guess, but something like 10 to 12 years from the few pieces I've read. So in the USA, there are things that distinguish American slavery from other forms of slavery. You could argue that its chattel nature does, although that was also true of Arabic slavery, as I understand. But one of those things was that you had this large area of the South where many plantations or many farming communities were mostly Black. And those Black people lived, for want of a better word. So from that came American Black culture. I mean, free Blacks emerged from that population of slaves who were eventually able to buy their freedom, or who were let go because they were potentially related to the quote-unquote master of the house, so on down the line. Black music emerged out of these Black communities that survived down there in the South. The Great Migration was the movement of these people to the North, and so on. So all that was, whether or not it could theoretically have been possible elsewhere, it only happened here because the slaves lived.
Yeah, I mean, you had 463,000 people imported to the United States in chains from Africa, and from that you had a population of 4 million slaves, 4 million Black Americans, about 90% of whom were slaves, in 1860. Yeah, and so I mean, one of the things I cited, I mean, the average life expectancy of a slave, an American slave in the 1850s, was about the same as that of a Frenchman. And so, it was obviously the life was not as good as the life of a Frenchman. The life was not as free as the life of a Frenchman, but it was a healthier environment in that sense. And so that's why you have the greater, creation of a people. And when I say creation of a people, that's not an artificial thing, right? Any people, any nation in the broadest sense, not even just, nation state, but, a people is formed out of a common history together, right? That's true of pretty much any nationality in the world. And so you have really two peoples, right? The African American people and the Hispanic people, broadly Hispanic peoples, of which there are quite a few, that are created out of the discovery of the Americas that did not exist in any way before, right? The African American people are an amalgam of many different African nationalities, and obviously the various Hispanic peoples, including both sort of white and black Hispanics, are derived from the mixture of Spanish and Portuguese people going to these places and mixing with the various the native tribes, and in some cases, with black slaves who were imported from Africa. And so that is part of the history of the world, is that when you can't unwind that. History only goes forward, but the different history, having a history together, is what creates a people. And so, that is a big part of our historical memory of slavery, and something that is part of, our unique American culture.
I'm curious, when you guys do the writing and you do the reading to learn about these things, there's a couple of thoughts that come to mind. How much is slavery's longevity and acceleration here in the Northern American continent is due just to simple logistics? We have things to grow, cotton, sugar, tobacco, whatever it is, and there's just not enough folks here to do that, because you got to have all these other things, and it is likely, I'm assuming, a low cost answer to we don't have enough folks here. And then also, it seems like maybe during the Enlightenment, we started to get this idea that, to Will's point, it's we no longer kill people and eat them and smash all their stuff and take what we want. We let people live, and in that growing humanity, there's still inhumanity in that. Now, what are you going to do with these folks? And then I'm going to add to this next thing is, also, when you do look for a path out, I had Kevin Adams and Don Fraser on your show yesterday. We were talking about, was there a better path for the Native Americans that might have happened and was, socially possible? And you don't want to say, no, it's impossible, but there's no obvious path. So is there another way out of this that we missed, or is this just sort of how this sort of had to play? I mean, as horrible as slavery is this sort of how it had to play out?
Well, there's always those what ifs that you can't really answer. I mean, I think there's a couple things to answer a couple of your questions. I mean, First of all, the question of why, right? Why did slavery exist in the Western Hemisphere? Why did it rise and grow in the Western Hemisphere? And there was an economist named F.C. Domar who did a very influential paper, probably about 50 years ago. And his argument was essentially that, and there's been some further refinements on his original theory since then about sort of the political conditions for creations of slave systems and serf systems. But his essential point was that one of the major commonalities that, the early American colonies had with Russia, right, was plentiful land and scarce labor. And so when you have lots of cheap land and expensive labor, there's much more of a drive to create a forced labor, a compelled labor force. And it's interesting because there's some contrasts to sort of the way things worked out in Europe after the Black Death, which is a whole complicated historical narrative of kind of why the Black Death and the destruction of a lot of the labor force, as well as the concentration of capital after that, right? Because when you depopulate half the continent, what happens? Well, the poor people don't have stuff, right? So when the poorer people die out, there's just few of them to do the work. right? Whereas the rich people have stuff. When half the rich people die, the stuff they own gets all concentrated among the remaining ones, right? So you actually ended up with larger estates and fewer people to work them. And there's a differing history between Eastern and Western Europe, because Western Europe, what essentially happens is now you can't force labor, you have to contract for it, and that's kind of the beginnings of free labor and modernity. Whereas in Eastern Europe, it goes in the opposite direction, in large part because of the nobility was poorer in capital and some other factors. But I mean, to me, when you look back, I mean, I don't think, if you look at different time periods, for example, if you look at the American founding, I don't know that there really is an alternative way to go in the 1770s and the 1780s. There was a big movement forward to eliminate slavery in half the country, to reach some compromises in the Constitution. I think in the period of like the 1810s and 1820s is where in American history you can ask a lot more of the what if questions of what if we had made a greater effort to prevent slavery from moving from Maryland and Virginia, where it was kind of dying out but only gradually, and because there was a huge transshipment internally of essentially surplus, economically surplus slaves to the whole cotton belt of Alabama and Mississippi, in the sugar growing regions of Louisiana. And had the country had the political will to, Congress didn't have the legal authority to stop slavery, but Congress always had the legal authority, had the political will to prevent interstate shipment of slaves. And there was a huge, what they called second middle passage of, enslaved people from Maryland and Virginia, down into Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, over the period between, 1810 and 1850.
Well,
yeah. So a couple thoughts. I mean, in terms of why slavery is used, I mean, to some extent, so the obvious answer is what Dan said. Slavery had been accepted for most of history. In terms of what are often called exploitation colonies, where you have a large amount of land that doesn't necessarily have many people on it, when you acquire it, it's a tempting way to develop that area. This actually gets into kind of my field of expertise in political science. I don't think slavery works very well. This is one of the points that I touch on in my essay. I mean, the argument that slavery made America wealthy essentially gets back to the idea that slaves produced things that were sometimes sold for value. But the question with slavery is slavery, given a situation where you have options, a more efficient way to produce goods or to farm or whatnot than virtually anything else? Does this sort of feudal peon agriculture involving unwilling captured warriors work very well? And in the case of the American South, I think there's a very substantial case to be made for no. I mean, historians and economists like Mark Schulman and Thomas Sowell have pointed out that, for example, just before the Civil War, 90%, 91%, I believe, of the skilled craftsmen in the United States lived in the North. This is the major reason the North won the Civil War, in fact. The North had 5 times as much physical plant. The South had more than a quarter by far of the USA's free population, but much less than that of any resource that might have been useful in the conflict. And that's not really unusual internationally. I mean, generally, excuse the non-technical term shitholes, but we find that post-slave societies, countries that had long-term slavery, then abolished it, and then dealt with the resulting ethnic conflict. The obvious example, unfortunately, is Haiti. But those countries dramatically underperform other nations that didn't have that institution and the follow-up problems. I mean, with that said, though, obviously it is tempting to make other people work for you for free, and that's not something that we as a group of nations or as a species abolished until pretty recently. I think the deeper question there that you touched on, Pete, is, was there an alternative? Are there alternatives to history, Harry Turtledove style?
yes.
I mean, would it have been possible And taking this dead seriously, for example, I mean, moving even beyond slavery, would it have been possible, for example, for the Western world to encounter the New World, encounter the Native American Indians, and not conquer them? To run into people that were equally warlike and equally brutal by any realistic standard. If you look at the Comanche or the Lakota or any of the major tribes, the Aztec, the Inca, and institute some kind of peaceful trade with them and attempt to develop those societies rather than going to war once the first atrocity happened on either end. I mean, I think that that's possible in the purely theoretical sense that there's, a value chance above zero, but there was no chance of that happening. I mean, the reality is that when these two warrior societies encountered one another, hundreds of years before the 1947 and 54 Geneva Conventions came down, what happened was pretty inevitable. This is even before you get into things like disease, for example. I mean, one of the things that we forget about the conquest of the New World is that a lot of it wasn't done by soldiers on horseback. I mean, there are multiple stories of people like De Soto, the first Europeans to enter the heartland of North America, seeing these sort of large, pretty close to civilization in terms of Cahokia, so on, towns lining the banks of rivers like the Mississippi. And these are sort of the outliers. These were the scouts. When larger parties came by 20, 40, 57, 100 years later, they found nothing. It was dust and bones. The germs that were brought from Europe had done a far better job of conquering and destroying the region than any group of humans could have. So would that have been avoidable? Would the transmission of, for example, tobacco, cocaine, and syphilis to the old world, which we forget about, by the way, in terms of deaths, or the transmission of the respiratory diseases to the New World, could that have been avoided? I don't think so. Well, similarly with slavery, I mean, if you're talking about the one question is, given this new set of exploitation colonies, I suppose, could the white English settlers have avoided redeveloping the institution of slavery through those kind of internal checks that Dan suggested? That's at least worth thinking about. But again, the reality is that up until this point, slavery existed throughout the entire Arab world. It existed throughout all of Eastern Europe. It was the accepted way of developing and settling new land that didn't have a lot of people on it and that you weren't too sure about what to do with. Even in Australia, I mean, they didn't use slaves, they used convict labor. But boat after boat of these unwilling British prostitutes and pickpockets and stonebreakers and so on was shipped over there. And that's what developed. The Australians are sensitive about this to this day, but that's what developed early Sydney, Melbourne, so on. So could that have been avoided by a different species in a different world, maybe?
Yeah, and I mean, Georgia originally started the same way as Australia, and then they
the British got the slaves of war.
And I mean, look, and this is a common theme among both, Native American relations and, sort of the slave trade and the arrival of the Europeans in Africa, right? If a superior race of aliens landed on this planet, inevitably, one of the first things that would happen is different groups of human beings would try to enlist them against their enemies. And that's kind of what, that's kind of the history of a lot of, like, when a new civilization arrives in town, like, what happens, right? You're whether it be, the Europeans with the arrival of the Muslims, in the Dark Ages, or whether it's the Europeans arriving in Africa, or I mean, the Aztecs were so awful to their neighbors. I mean, Cortez basically, everybody else who was a neighbor to the Aztecs was like, oh, well, this is great. This guy's come to liberate us from the Aztec oppressors, right? I mean,
he also may kill us in war, but he won't eat us. I mean, like, the Aztec, being conquered by the Aztecs was at a different level historically. That's pretty much the comment there.
When you bring in Cortez too, I always want to add into this when we talk about germs overtaking people. The explorers that went somewhere and tried to be nice, more often than the guys that cracked skulls when they got there, those guys were eliminated, and we don't talk about them. They're dead, and they didn't do anything else. The one thing we know, anecdotally about Captain Cook is that he got smoked in Hawaii. We don't really know anything else about his career. So he's like the last guy to go somewhere and be like, I'm here. And then you don't know when the party is going to jump off, good or bad. And so you're ready as a good captain to take care of your people. And if you have these guns and they don't, you're almost you're almost fated to go ahead and establish your dominance as a point of staying alive yourself, because there's just not enough of you, and it
Yeah, I
always
mean,
strikes me.
disease definitely has a big effect on the history of slavery. I mean, the European slaves imported to Africa, as well as European explorers, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, well into the 1850s, were not equipped to, they died out. Right, the Native Americans in huge numbers are on the arrival of the Europeans died out. Black slaves from Africa who were shipped to North America found it a healthy climate. The ones who were shipped to like Italy, did not do so well in North Italy and North Africa. They had, the slave owners there had similar problems with, they were buying all these people and they died. And so, that's just, I mean, human beings, whatever else we are still biological creatures, and we're subject to all of that, as certainly the last couple of years have reminded us. Even our modern medicine hasn't totally freed us from all of that.
Yeah. When you guys get the assignment to write on this, how do you pick which avenue you're taking? I know, Will, like with the 1776 Unites, you kind of have a home base, but still, you don't want to write the same thing over and over again. And you've written in this lane before, and then I'll let Will go first, and then Dan, answer the same thing. How did you pick this long historical narrative?
Well, actually, I should go first, because literally what happened was that I was writing this from research I was doing, and I pitched it to do as like a cover story in the magazine, or as part of a project for the magazine, and we sort of, the compromise idea was, why don't we put this together with a couple of other pieces from people who can bring particular expertise to the table. One of whom was Will, and so we decided to sort of make an issue out of it.
Yeah, for me, I mean, it actually is kind of a question how not to write the same thing several times. I mean, I'm often asked about some of the points made in Taboo. For example, the Black Lives Matter numbers versus reality, or the sort of confusing fact for people coming from a quote unquote systemic racism perspective that many of the most successful groups in the USA are Asian and Black immigrants. And I've written both of those essays a couple times. I don't really necessarily plan to write them again. This with 1776 Unites is, again, something I'm fairly often asked to talk about. I was contacted by National Review. I had heard that Dan was going to be in the article. I hadn't heard about the other authors. There were 6 or 7, I believe, by the end. And it seemed like a good group. And I said, I'm willing to write about 1619 again, as long as it's from a somewhat different, broader perspective. So, I mean, the points in my essay are, 1, pretty much what Dan said, slavery was massively historically pervasive, but also 2, economic impact, 3, the resistance to it that was minimized. 1619 doesn't really discuss Frederick Douglass. And 4th, just this sort of very broad claim, everything came out of this. And I do mention Irish, East Asian, so on, immigration. So that's how they sort of came and got me. For me, usually I'm asked if I want to write something. I pitch sometimes. But right now, for example, I might pitch an essay on whether or not race is real, co-written with someone working for a site like 23andMe. I mean, obviously, the old categories like Caucasian don't necessarily, or African, don't necessarily mean a whole lot. That latter one would include blacks, Khoisan, some whites. But are there categories that do? But most of the time, someone will just reach out to me in the inbox, and if it sounds good, I'll usually reply and say yeah. So that's my process, I suppose.
One of the things we've discussed in the past, Will, is the specter being way bigger than the actual problem. And I don't want to limit, the damage that slavery does for all people. But we do have this problem where we can't seem to get past the, this lived history, the 400 years of oppression and all of these things. And I'm not trying to in any way make light of this. This is a real problem for us socially as a country. So, okay, granted, slavery has gone on forever and ever and probably will continue to go on because it is happening today. There are open slave markets in the world. Mm-hmm. But what do we do here? I mean, you're the political scientist. What do we do to try to start to deflate that specter? And also, part of what 1619 is, it forced us to have this conversation, and they get credit for that. So how do we deal with this? How do we get past this point of, we had a history of slavery. We also ended slavery. How do we go forward?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are a couple of points to your question, and I mean, Dan's been making at least as much sense as I have, so I'm not going to go on at length with this one. But I mean, first of all, I don't think 1619 opened this conversation about the historical impact of slavery. When you look at some of the work that serious historians have been doing, so on down the line, that's one of the reasons I think the 1619 project actually irritated a lot of people. When you get in, and I actually wasn't all that irritated by this. I am not a historian. But when you get into a lot of these CRT debates, kind of the claim on the activist political left is, well, the other side doesn't want to teach history. And I think that the reality is that, I mean, the pre 1619 sort of Howard Zinn curriculum in the schools isn't that far right. Most people were raised, black or white, being quite aware that slavery is bad. There were Native American military victories. The natives lost in the end. That was brutal, so on down the line. There are very few educated Americans that don't know this. So I think 1619's role was to some extent reiterating some of this in a popular paper, some badly done, some well done. In terms of what do we do about the fact we once had slavery, I think that as intellectuals, one important thing we can do is provide context. And that doesn't ever mean excusing this. But when I mentioned the fact that women couldn't vote in the majority of states, I won't say anywhere, but until 1920, or that most whites came here from penniless European countries that were slave societies themselves in many cases until rather recently. This is a slightly different issue, but the Holocaust ended in 1945. We shut down the last function, the last camp in 1946. So pointing out that all of these bad things happened, we're going to talk about all of them honestly. We're not going to focus on just one of them, I think is a useful part of the exercise. And what can you do beyond that? I guess this does get to one of my pat lines, but essentially give everyone the same rights, perhaps do a little remedial stuff for formerly disadvantaged groups at first, let people compete. I mean, so in the USA, the Civil War was over, Confederacy broken and rather brutally conquered, by the way, 1865. De jure segregation ended in 1954. Racism has been illegal since 64. There's been pro-minority affirmative action since 1967. I keep coming back to that. So, yes, of course, we have a brutal history, as many countries do. But that second point is also true. I don't think I'm at a disadvantage if I were to go in for job talks outside of KSU. So that's basically it. Treat people like people.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of what is dangerous about kind of left-wing view of a lot of this stuff is the idea that we should take history that we can't go back and change, right? History that we've inherited, and to say that we should use this as a justification to do more classifying people and giving people unequal opportunities and unequal treatment because of where they came from and who they came from. I mean, I think you can always do things in a way that is race neutral, but that has some sensitivity to the idea that there are still pockets of very unequal opportunity in America, that there are people who just don't have chances, and you can work on policies across the board, whether it's tax or education or whatever, to try to offer more ways out, more ways up for people who have particular problems. There are always problems that demand more solutions. But I think that the overall lesson though is that I think the wrong turn every time that throughout history, slavery, an essential element of slavery in most societies, with a few exceptions like Russia, like Korea, was that slaves were others, right? They were somebody who was an outsider to your society, however that was construed, whether it's on an ethnic basis, a racial basis, a religious basis, or simply they were the people next door. And so I think the more that we try to keep our focus on classifying people in groups rather than offering them equality as individuals, I think that's doing the exact opposite of what we ought to do. But as intellectuals, I think that our duty is just to tell the truth and to put things in their proper context, and to have some I think you can have some empathy for the people of the past. Try to put yourself in their shoes. Sometimes more empathy means more condemnation rather than more excuse, because you can see who didn't really have a good reason for the things they did. But I think you do have to do the work first. I think you do the work first of laying out the context of understanding how things happened and why they happened, and judgment follows from that.
Yeah, and by the way, history is not easy. You have to master a body of it. We just had two historians on yesterday, and one's like, I know about Texas, I don't know about that. And these guys are brilliant at history. The other guy's like, I know more about how people live together. These are very siloed things. So you have to be able to stack it, process it, contextualize it, a lot of different things. And then also you can't put your own reality too far into it because, look, you didn't live in the frontier. It was dangerous in a lot of the world 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Your well-being wasn't guaranteed, whether it was germs or guns that are going to kill you. It was easy to get killed. It's hard to hold a nation together, fellas, that's nascent like the U.S. was in the beginning. You have to have compromises that suck because that's the only way to keep going forward.
I think the complete failure, and I do think that the complete failure of empathy on the part of Nicole Hannah-Jones and some of the other sort of key 1619 people is endemic in the failures, the intellectual failures that happen in a bunch of places there. So I think just looking at this in terms of, it almost kind of parts of it read like political opposition research, like what can we find to throw at these guys, rather than trying to understand them, as they understood themselves. It's just, sort of, so much of her essay and the other key essays there just sort of treats white people as essentially the other. And that's also not a productive way, to write history. And the other thing to always remember about history is, look, it's like any other area. I think you have to respect the expertise of the people who have done the work. But you can't blindly defer to them either, because they're people too, and they have their own agendas, and they have their own disagreements, and they have their own blind spots. And so, you as an informed consumer of history, you take the word of everybody for what it's worth. You take some respect for the experts and expertise and the background they bring to it, but you ultimately have to, you got to do the work yourself and make your own judgments in reading what people have brought you.
Will, anything in closing?
Yeah, I think Dan's summary there was good. My one point about expertise, very briefly, would be logic isn't a discipline-specific skill. So when and I think this is fairly important, for example, as some of the claims of Nicole Hannah-Jones, for example, when you watch a discussion in a field of, say, academic expertise, of course you should understand that the people in that discussion have more experience in the specific field than you do. So, i.e., a historian has read more historical articles and texts than I have in general. For that matter, Dan has made more historical points than I have throughout this conversation. Pete, you've made quite a few. So my primary field is not history. But I also think that the average educated person, certainly a scholar in a different field or someone who has, for example, elite military training, many people can look at the disputes in a field and figure out pretty quickly what they are. What are the major positions? What are the major claims about American history? And when someone says something that, based on that logical understanding, doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, like the claim about American slavery being unique or being sort of the creative force for the country, I think it's perfectly appropriate for anyone to push back and say, well, no, that doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense. So logic itself is a broad ability that most people have. It's not discipline specific. What can you do as an intellectual? I think tell the truth is a great piece of advice. What can you do as a citizen? Expect the truth and call out claims that don't seem to be factually based.
I love it. Everybody should go check out the National Review's piece here on this stuff. There's a number of articles. Will has one. And of course, Dan is leading the way. Just go to nationalreview.com. There's a link right there in the show notes. If you're listening on the podcast side, it'll be there. Also, there's the link for Will's piece. Again, just go to National Review and type in Wil Reilly. You'll find it. Also, go check out Will's books. His books like Taboo. I love that thing. I mean, when's the next book coming out, Will?
The next book, well, that's the short answer is it's due into the publisher in July. Okay. I've talked about a couple concepts. Some of them are technically confidential, but the next one is going to, it's almost a revision since we're talking about history of the classic 12 lies my teacher told me, which came from sort of a left-wing perspective and looked at the time, some of the kind of jingoistic things that were being said about the USA in a lot of schools. And I think 20 or 25 years down the road, we can look at a whole new woke generation of educators and see that a lot of the things that they're saying, the natives were a peaceful people who spent all day in dancing, or that guy McCarthy really didn't find any communists, those also don't pass the smell test or the test of time. Those are also wrong. So I'm kind of revising this and saying, and this is, I hope, something people take from all of my books, look at the things the left says, look at the things the hard right says, and then compare to fact. What is the reality? So that's the next book, looking at sort of American education with a focus on history, actually.
Cool. And then Dan, anything in closing for you?
Yeah, no, that's more or less consistent with my view. I mean, look, my training ultimately is as a lawyer, so I always think in terms of evidence, and I always think in terms of, one thing that we lawyers understand is that, you always know that the other people who know your field are just as likely to be full of it, and you learn. Taking depositions of experts and stuff that you can find experts on both sides of any question. So yeah, go where the evidence leads you, and and be excellent to one another.
Cool. Be excellent. It's like Bill and Ted said. And then Chris Thomas's book, the link is there. If you guys are interested in understanding what I think is the real history of the blues, or the most recent good version of it, go get Chris's book and be prepared to be blown away at his fantastic body of knowledge, and also his incredible ability to actually play the blues. So let me wrap this thing up, fellas. I'll be right back.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much for watching the Break